On television, the boss of a New Jersey crime family sits in a mansion with a pool out back, and the money is never really the problem. In real life, the men the television family was built on answered to a boss who sold plumbing supplies for a living and clocked out of a union job to go commit their crimes. This is the family the press would spend 20 years calling the real Sopranos. The men who ran it had day jobs, real ones: foremen, union agents, a plumber, a fish market hand. And the older, richer families across the river in New York had a nickname for them. They called them the farmers. I want you to hold one object in your mind for the next half hour. It is a pen. The ordinary kind a federal prosecutor slides across a table when he wants a made man to sign a cooperation agreement and give up every person he has ever loved. For roughly 100 years, that pen sat on the table in front of the DeCavalcante crime family, and not one made member ever picked it up. That silence was the one thing the smallest family in America owned that the big New York Borgatas actually respected. It was the only currency these men were never short on. Now, the story you have heard about them is that they were broke, humble, working-class gangsters who kept honest jobs because the rackets did not pay enough to quit. Part of that is true, and the part that is true is stranger than the show ever let on. But the part almost everyone gets wrong is that word, broke. Because the plumber pleaded guilty to a gambling operation that moved $20 million a year, and one of his captains ran securities fraud on Wall Street. These men were not poor. The version you have not heard is worse than poor, and it ends with the pen. Long before anyone thought to compare them to a television show, they were the family nobody in New York wanted to be. The 5 families of New York built armies. At their peak, the DeCavalcantes could field maybe 40 or 50 made men in the whole state of New Jersey, and that was a good year. They came up out of Elizabeth and Newark, immigrant Sicilian stock, a lot of them from a single town called Ribera on the southern coast of Sicily. They even named their social club after it. The Ribera Social Club sat in Elizabeth, and if you walked past it, you would have thought it was exactly what it pretended to be: a place where older Italian men played cards and complained about their knees. The family did not start with the plumber either. It ran back decades before him, through a boss named Stefano Badami, who held the Elizabeth faction together in the years around the Second World War, until the family's own internal feuds caught up with him, and he was murdered in 1955. After him came a brief run under Filippo Amari, who eventually retired back to Sicily, and then Nicholas Delmore, who was boss when the National Commission of the American Mafia held its infamous meeting in the tiny town of Appalachian, New York, in 1957. When state troopers stumbled onto that summit and dozens of the country's most powerful mobsters went scrambling into the woods, the little New Jersey family had men in the room. They were small, but they were seated at the national table. When Delmore died in 1964, the family passed to his nephew, and the nephew was the plumber. That was the reputation the whole way down. Small, rural, beneath notice. On the CNBC accounts of this family, you will hear the New York boss's own words for them: farmers, country bumpkins, the crew from across the water who did not really count. The men in Manhattan and Brooklyn ran their operations out of glittering nightclubs and made national headlines. And the New Jersey crew ran theirs out of the back of a heating and cooling supply store off the turnpike. So the New York bosses laughed at them and the nickname stuck. And the DeCavalcantes did the one thing a small family can do to survive next to giants. They kept their heads down and they kept their mouths shut, and they built a reputation for a kind of honor the bigger families had already started to lose. Here is where the television part comes in, and I am going to give it to you straight, because the internet has spent 2 decades getting it slightly wrong. In March of 1999, an FBI recording device captured 2 DeCavalcante men talking about a new HBO show that had just premiered. One of them, a soldier named Joseph Sclafani, asks the other whether the show is supposed to be them. The other man, a captain, named Anthony Rotondo, tells him, "Yes, you are in there," and then adds, "What characters? Great acting." That tape was real, and it was played in a federal courtroom 4 years later. But notice who started the comparison. It was the mobsters sitting there flattered. David Chase, the man who created the show, has only ever said he drew on families like this one in part. He grew up in New Jersey. He borrowed from more than one crew. The real Sopranos label was something these men put on themselves, and then the newspapers ran with it, and then it became a fact that was never quite a fact. And that brings us back to the pen, and to the promise I need you to remember. For 100 years, no made man in this family ever cooperated with the government. Not one. In a business where every other family in America was hemorrhaging rats by the 1990s, the farmers held. Keep that in mind, because the story of who finally broke it is the whole reason this video exists, and the man who did it is already in the room. So before I take you up the chain of these men and show you what each of them did for a living, I want to put you at that table. Imagine 30 years of clocking in. 30 years as a made man in the one family that New York never respected, the family whose only real asset was that its men did not talk. And now a federal prosecutor sits across from you, and he lays out the rest of your life. Prison until you die, or a pen. Sign it, betray the only thing that ever gave you a rank, and walk out into a new name in a town you have never seen. Or say nothing, keep the code, and rot in a cell. Sign the paper, or rot. In that chair, what do you actually do? Tell me in the comments, because the men in this story could not agree on the answer, and it tore them apart. And if you are new here, subscribe. I pull these cases out of trial transcripts and FBI wires every week, so the pen was on the table. But what these men did with their working lives before any prosecutor ever showed up is where the real story hides. Start at the top. The boss who gave the family its name was Simone DeCavalcante, and everyone called him Sam the Plumber. The nickname was not Decoration. He owned a plumbing and heating supply business in Kenilworth, New Jersey, a real company with a real storefront, and he ran a good deal of his empire out of the back of it. He hated the nickname, by the way. He thought of himself as an aristocrat, claimed a bloodline back to Italian nobility, and preferred to be called the Count. The men called him the Plumber anyway. And here's the detail everyone missed at the time. The FBI understood exactly how much of his life ran through that supply store. So from 1961 to 1965, they bugged it. Those recordings became known as the DeCavalcante tapes, hundreds of hours of a mob boss doing business, and they are one of the richest windows into how a family like this actually operated that federal agents ever captured. On one of those tapes, Sam describes a nightmare he keeps having about a group of policemen, confiding it to a woman who was both his secretary and his mistress. A boss losing sleep, jumping at shadows, telling a woman in his office about the anxiety eating him alive. Decades before a fictional New Jersey boss started having panic attacks on a television screen, the real one was already sweating through his nights and talking about it out loud in a room the FBI had wired. The Plumber Act worked, and it worked because a day job is a wonderful thing to hide behind. Nobody searches a man who looks like he works for a living, but do not mistake the coveralls for the accounts. In 1969, Sam DeCavalcante was indicted alongside more than 50 associates, and he pleaded guilty to running a gambling operation that federal prosecutors said turned over $20 million a year. That is the man behind the plumbing counter. He got about 5 years and served roughly 2, and he eventually retired to Florida, where he died in 1997. The plumber was never broke. He just dressed like it, and the costume was so good that half a century later people still call it humble. Those same tapes caught the man just under him and gave us maybe the truest thing anyone in this family ever said about the honest life. His consigliere in that era was Frank Majuri, a man who told the world he was a labor foreman. And by the record, he actually held the position, a foreman's job with an industrial firm over in the Linden area. He was the picture of the working gangster, the union card, the lunch pail, the whole costume. And on one of the DeCavalcante recordings, Majuri says a line that should be carved over the door of this entire story. "If you are a real honest guy," he says, "you wind up a hunchback with headaches." That was the family's actual philosophy, spoken out loud, on tape, by the number 3 man. Honest work breaks your back and gives you nothing. The day job was never the point. The day job was the alibi. And Frank Majuri's own son, a man they would come to call Big Ears, was listening and learning, and he would still be circling the top of this family decades later, long after almost everyone else in this story was dead or gone. The trial transcript tells a different story about the next man at the top, too. When Sam faded into his Florida retirement, the family passed to John Riggi, known as the Eagle. And Riggi is the sharpest example of what this video is really about. Because Riggi had a day job that sounds honest right up until you look at it. He was a business agent for a laborers' union local in Elizabeth, Local 394. He was a union man. And in the received version of these men, that is the whole charm. The gangster who also held a real card in a real trade. Except the union was not the honest thing next to the crime. The union was the crime. Riggi used that local to shake down construction contractors across the region, to place no-show jobs, to bleed the pension funds, to decide who got to build and who did not. In 1990, he was convicted of exactly that, labor racketeering and extortion, and he went away for 15 years. The same discipline and patience that made him a respected union figure was the machinery he used to loot the men he claimed to represent. The day job did not make him honest. It gave him a bigger set of victims. And Riggi's own local tells you the machine did not need him personally to keep running, because the union was full of his people. One of the men who rose through that same world was Francesco Guarraci, an immigrant who had come over from Ribera, the very town in Sicily the family's social club was named for. Guarraci climbed toward the top of the DeCavalcante organization, and according to one journalist who documented him closely, he did it while he kept right on working as a foreman in Riggi's laborers' locale. Sit with that. A man rises to help run a Cosa Nostra family, and his cover is not some no-show fiction. He is actually out there on the job sites, actually holding a foreman's whistle, a real immigrant success story stapled to the back of a criminal enterprise. The honest work and the family were not 2 lives for these men. They were one life wearing 2 hats, and the hard hat was the one people were meant to see. Because Riggi ran the family from a prison cell for years, he had to leave the daily operation to other men, which is how the family ended up governed for a stretch by a panel rather than a single boss. That structure matters because it put more captains in charge of more crews with more room to make the kind of mistake that gets people killed. And it elevated men like the family's longtime counselor, a figure the federal court said served as consigliere for something like 35 years, a man they called Steve the truck driver. Even the wise man of the family, the keeper of its counsel across 4 decades, wore a working man's nickname like a badge. Riggi himself would spend more than 2 decades behind bars before he finally came home an old man, and he died in 2015, most of his adult life given to a cell. The years the family ran without a strong boss at the top were the years the bodies started stacking. And this is where the humble working men become something else entirely. Before Vinny Ocean, before the flip, there was already a pattern of the family eating its own. A captain named Vincent Rotondo, the father of the Anthony Rotondo you heard on that wiretap, was shot to death outside his own home in early 1988. Groceries reportedly still in the car. A few years later, a longtime captain named Louis LaRasso simply vanished in 1991, believed murdered by his own people. His body never recovered. These were not soldiers in a street war with a rival family. These were senior men, killed or disappeared by the very organization they had given their lives to. The family that sold itself as loyal and quiet was, on the inside, quietly killing the men who had built it. This is where it stops being business and starts being the most Sopranos thing in the entire real story. Because the next captain is the one with the most direct line to the show, and his day job is the one you would least expect. His name was Vincent Palermo, and they called him Vinny Ocean. The nickname came from the water. As a young man, he worked the Fulton Fish Market in Lower Manhattan, the brutal pre-dawn shift, hauling fish in the cold before the city woke up. An honest, back-breaking job for an honest wage. But Vinny Ocean did not stay at the fish market. He became a made man, then a captain, and he built his money on something the television show would borrow almost whole. He owned a go-go club in Queens called Wiggles, a strip club. If you have seen the show, you already know the set it inspired. The neon, the back office, the boss holding court among the dancers. That was Vinny Ocean's actual place of business, and it was real before it was ever a set. And Vinny Ocean was one of the men on that wiretap era, one of the men living the life the cameras were quietly turning into prestige television. Remember him, because when I tell you who finally picked up the pen, his name is going to be one of the first two out of my mouth. And he does not spend the rest of his life the way a man of honor is supposed to. If that sounds like the money was thin, here is the man who ends that myth for good. One of the family's captains was Filippo Abramo, and the newspapers gave him a nickname that makes the whole broke story collapse. They called him the King of Wall Street. Abramo was not skimming coffee can cash out of a social club. He ran securities fraud, stock schemes, the kind of white-collar crime that moves real money in real markets, and prosecutors tied him to millions. A mafia captain in a family the New York bosses mocked as farmers, running frauds out of the financial capital of the world. The retirement plan, it turned out, could wear a suit and a good watch. These men were called broke by people who never once looked at the ledger. And then there's the soldier who makes the day job story almost unbearable to say with a straight face. His name was Anthony Capo, and on paper he was a certified asbestos abatement worker. A legitimate, licensed trade, the kind of blue-collar credential that fit the family's whole humble image. There was just one problem with Anthony Capo's professional certification. By his own later account, he slept through the training class, and when it came time to sit the exam, he had the equipment operator take the test for him. That is the day job. A made man who could not be bothered to pass the test for the honest trade he was supposedly hiding behind, so he cheated his way through it the same way he did everything else. Play that straight for a second and let it sit. The certificate on the wall was as fake as the humility. And Anthony Capo would spend the last 3 years of his life wishing he had thought harder about a decision he had not made yet. Because Anthony Capo is the other name I am about to give you. But before the pen, you have to see what these working men did on the clock that had nothing to do with plumbing or fish. Because the darkest work this family ever performed was done, in part, as a favor for the exact New York bosses who laughed at them. On September 11, 1989, a man named Fred Weiss was killed on Staten Island. Weiss was a former newspaperman turned developer who had gotten tangled in a federal investigation, and John Gotti's Gambino family across the river wanted him gone before he could become a problem. The Gambinos were the giants. The DeCavalcantes were the farmers. So the giants asked the farmers to handle it, the way you might ask a smaller, eager neighbor to do a job you would rather not have your own fingerprints on. And the farmers said yes. Vinny Ocean Palermo was among the shooters. Anthony Capo, the man who cheated his asbestos test, was behind the wheel. They killed Fred Weiss as a favor, to earn a little respect from men who would never fully give it. And here is the part that tells you everything about the machine. Not long after, an associate who knew too much about the Weiss killing was himself murdered, silenced so the favor could stay buried. One body to do the job, a second body to protect the first. That is the arithmetic these humble working men actually ran, and it is a long way from a union hall. The retirement plan, as ever, was a basement, or a car, or a parking lot. Take October of 1998. An associate named Joseph Masella, a gambler everyone called Joey O, was drowning in debt, something in the neighborhood of $450,000 owed on his own bad luck. In this family, a man that far underwater is not a person anymore. He is a liability with a face. So Joey O got a phone call from someone he trusted, a voice promising to help him dig out, telling him to come to a golf course in Brooklyn to talk it through. He went. He was shot in the parking lot of that golf course and left there. He had come looking for a lifeline and walked into the last conversation of his life. You do not buy silence with a one-time payment. You buy it with a bullet when the debt gets bigger than the man. For 100 years, through all of it, the pen sat untouched. Then, the government stopped treating this family like a joke, and everything the farmers had built on silence came apart in about 4 years. By the late 1990s, the FBI had decided the smallest family in America was finally worth breaking, and they moved on it from the bottom and the middle at once. In December of 1999, agents arrested around 40 members and associates in a single sweep. And that is when the thing that had never happened in the family's entire history happened twice. 2 made men decided they would rather sign than die in a cell. One of them was the soldier who cheated his asbestos exam, Anthony Capo. The other was the captain who owned the strip club, Vinny Ocean Palermo. The men who had spent their lives inside the one family, too proud and too small to produce a rat, became the first made DeCavalcante members ever to pick up the pen. That was the story the public knew. The humble Jersey crew that kept the code when everyone else folded. The grand jury heard a different one. Because once Vinny Ocean started talking, he did not stop at a single confession. In 2000, he pleaded guilty to 4 murders and a stack of conspiracies, extortion, loan sharking, gambling, and then he took the whole ledger with him into that courtroom. He named the structure. He named the men. He explained how a family that ran itself out of union halls and supply stores and a go-go club had ordered people killed. A cooperating captain is not a leak. He is a flood, and Vinny Ocean was 30 years of institutional memory pouring straight into the federal record. And the murders he and Capo cleared were not tidy. Understand what these humble working men were capable of when the code demanded it. There was the acting boss named John D'Amato, who was killed by his own people around 1992 after word spread about his private life. The justification one of the shooters gave later was chillingly practical. Nobody, he said, was going to respect them if they had a boss like that sitting down to discuss Cosa Nostra business. In a family whose entire brand was respect, a man died to protect the brand. There was Fred Weiss, killed for gaudy. There was Joey O, killed for a debt. Day jobs by morning, and this by night. Everything the family had, it lost in the courtrooms that followed. In 2006, 3 of its leaders, the longtime consigliere they called the truck driver, and 2 captains, one of them Filippo Abramo, the king of Wall Street, were sentenced to life in prison. That should have been the end of the sentence, cleanly told. But the honest version has a wrinkle, and this audience deserves the wrinkle. In 2008, a federal appeals court vacated those 3 convictions, ruling that the trial had improperly used the guilty plea statements of men who never took the stand, a violation of the defendant's right to confront the witnesses against them. The men were not walked out to freedom and a parade. The case went back for further proceedings. But the clean headline of 3 mob bosses buried under life terms turned out to be more complicated than the first draft of history said. And if you only ever saw the arrest photos, you never learned that part. Here is the reversal that grades the whole story. The thing that had protected these men for a century, the silence, the code, the refusal to talk, was never really about honor at all. It held because nobody bothered to squeeze a family this small. The New York Giants got the wiretaps and the task forces and the relentless federal attention, and their men flipped by the dozen under that pressure. The farmers were left alone precisely because they looked like farmers, and 100 years of loyalty was partly just 100 years of not being worth the effort. The moment the government decided they were worth it, the code that everyone romanticized folded faster than New York's ever did. The proudest silence in the American Mafia turned out to be the least tested, and the tape tells you they saw it coming, in a way. Go back to those 2 men in the car in 1999, flattered that a television show might be about them. Sclafani asking if that is supposed to be us. Rotondo saying what characters. Great acting. Within a few years of that conversation, that world was gone. Rotondo himself became a cooperating witness. The men who preened at being called the real Sopranos ended up doing the one thing the real code forbids, and the show outlived the family that inspired it by decades. When the retired FBI agent who led the case totaled it up, the arithmetic was brutal. His team secured 71 convictions, solved 11 murders, and effectively dismantled the DeCavalcante crime family. 71. From the family too small to bother with. And the men at the center of that collapse were exactly the working men the title promised you. Sam the plumber died in Florida in 1997, before the worst of it, the only mercy in the story. John Riggi, the union man, gave 22 years to a prison cell and came home old to die in 2015. Philip Abramo, the king of Wall Street, went down with the rest. And Vinny Ocean Palermo, the fish market kid who owned the club that inspired the set, disappeared into witness protection under a new name, ran a strip club down in Texas under an alias, and eventually filed for bankruptcy. The man who helped end 100 years of silence did not get a mansion with a pool. He got a fake name and an empty bank account, which was either the smartest thing he ever did or the emptiest. And the strangest part is that the family did not quite die. It shrank down toward almost nothing and kept limping. Years after the collapse, federal agents were still running operations against what was left of it, still making arrests, still finding a handful of men trying to keep the old rackets breathing on a smaller and sadder scale. The foreman from Ribera, Guarraci, lived on into the next decade before cancer took him, and when he was gone, the name circling the top of what remained was Majuri, the son of the same Frank Majuri who had said on tape half a century earlier that an honest man ends up a hunchback with headaches. The family had come almost full circle, back to the working man's name it started with, running on fumes, still small, still mocked, still there. So they were working men. That part was always true. What the story left out is what the work was for. The plumbing counter hid the gambling book. The union card was the extortion. The foreman's whistle was the cover. The strip club was the empire. And the honest asbestos certificate was a lie a man told to pass as ordinary. For 100 years, the pen sat capped on that table, and the whole world read the silence as honor, when a good part of it was only ever size. And in the end, it was the plumber's family, the clock punchers, the ones New York never thought were worth the trouble of breaking, who picked up the pen and signed away the last thing they owned.